Okay, so welcome to our 2023 Mindbridge Edge conference, the Human Edge. So I want to welcome Adriano Koshiyama, who's the co-CEO of Holistic AI. I met Adriano a number of years ago now, right at the beginning of Holistic AI's journey. I met both of them when we were looking at who could we get to do third-party assurance of our algorithms, and I came across many of Adriano's papers on this subject. And I thought, oh, these guys really know what they're talking about. We should talk. And it's been a pleasure working with Holistic AI. Mindbridge is an ethical AI company, and it's really great to work with another one. We're both really committed to ensuring that AI safety is critically considered a critical part of AI. And I'm really excited to see Holistic AI's growth and some of the key things that they're looking at in terms of kind of how AI regulation is growing and how we can audit and assess, risk manage AI systems. Adriano comes from a very storied background. He has a PhD in computer science, which focused on computational finance and machine learning. And he was also worked at UCL and was a fellow at the Alan Turing Institute. So just welcome to Mindbridge, Adriano. I'm going to hand over to you to start talking about going beyond SOC 1 or certification, auditing and risk managing AI systems.
I'm very delighted to be here, and thanks for the glowing introduction, Rachel. It's been a pleasure, I would say, to work with Mindbridge over the years, and it's always great to work with a company that takes risk management of AI systems seriously, and then wants to really go beyond what a normal company would do, which is amazing. So that shows you the customer care that Mindbridge has to its own company. So thank you very much. Thanks, team from Mindbridge, for putting this event together. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about going beyond SOC 1 certification and what does it mean to go beyond. And that's how we say, talking about auditing and risk management of AI systems. As Rachel said, I'm Adriano Koshiyama. I'm the co-founder of Holistic. That's my contact, my email. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions, any follow-ups. I'm very happy and have a very much open door policy. So always happy to answer any questions you may have. Just to give you a little bit of background on us, on Holistic, we are an AI governance, risk, and compliance platform. We help companies to adopt and really make that adoption not only on a quicker, but also enable them to be done on a safe, legal, and ethical manner. We are a university now. We spun out of University College London almost now 4 years ago. But 20 plus clients in 3 different continents. We had 60 plus people as a company with 20 people a year ago, so growing quite rapidly. Lots and lots of academic research, and that research has been featured in many places. World Economic Forum, MIT Tech Review, Washington Post, European Commission website, to name it. And very recently, we're being named as a top 100 AI company globally by CB Insights, the same tier as OpenAI and Anthropic and a few other big names. My joke is that we don't have the same level of funding that they have, but who knows, that can change soon. Very much based out of London, but we're now having a growing team in the US, particularly with an office in Palo Alto on the west coast of the US. Just to go into the presentation, I'll start very briefly. Why we should try to go beyond SOC 1 and even SOC 2 even. I can even go beyond and saying that. And then finally goes into the specifics of what is an AI audit and more or less how someone could conduct an AI audit itself. Of course, I'll try to keep it as high level as possible, but I'm happy to have a separate conversation with any of you about the more details around that. Just don't need to go much into details. What is a SOC 1 audit? It's basically an audit to ascertain some of the company's internal safeguards around financial statements, processing and reporting of that data. Mostly it's done by organizations that want to process financial transactions. It's quite a vital piece of infrastructure, similar to For example, a lot of tech providers, they're providing SaaS software, they go through a SOC 2 type of audit. So it looks at processes, looks at control pieces you have, etc. Extremely important, almost like I would say it's a very vital handshake that you could provide, to start a relationship with a customer, demonstrate that you have good controls around your infrastructure, and not only infrastructure from a technical perspective, but from an internal perspective around people and processes as well. Very interesting, very important, quite comprehensive in some ways. However, it's even though it's a comprehensive type of audit, with this big growth of adoption of AI taking place, it's clear that SOC 1, SOC 2, etc., they don't cover very well the AI piece. So that's why putting forward the concept of AI audits, which we believe may become soon like a SOC X type of certification, is quite vital. And why do you need that? I think there's an element of being very specific to AI systems. It's very tailored to specific AI risks. It also very important for some cases where you want to demonstrate compliance with regulations, as well as do that similar to the handshake that you do in SOC 1, SOC 2. It's almost like on that spirit where you bring in a third party to come and look at your system. So you're trying to address some stakeholder concerns and boost confidence and minimize some risks. I'll go into each one of them into details of why this is so important. So let me get a slide which kind of summarize what's going on. As I think it's clear for a lot of the attendees, we are going through a huge revolution. And I believe we are just at the beginning of the S-curve. We are having AI adoption increasing over and over. The AI is getting built and adopted and deployed at a growing pace. We have some percentage that I believe that's provided by Gartner. I do think that by the end of this decade, we will see those numbers getting to about 60 to 70%. That's where the linear growth stops and the S-curve starts to kick in. Demand side looks very interesting, big adoption. What about the supply side? Supply side of the equation, we have an explosion of AI vendors. I'm naming here a few that are providing this Gen AI type of softwares, but undoubtedly, you have, if you look at the CB insights that I've mentioned, you have providers for every single vertical of AI, and you go from healthcare to financial services to insurance, like MindBridge, for example, another one. You name it, you can go to any type of sector or application, you're going to find AI vendors there. So big implosion as well of suppliers in the space. A lot of demand, a lot of suppliers. As you can imagine, there are going to be side effects. Things are going to happen, and there has been quite a lot of incidents. We can name them that way: harms, lawsuits, fines. They're happening around AI globally. I would say every week we can name a new piece of lawsuits that someone is getting about infringing IP, to someone getting fined because their algorithm has demonstrated bias, for example. That's happening almost like every week nowadays. I would probably say in a few years it's going to happen. If nothing's done before that, it will happen on a daily basis. That's one aspect. So a lot of incidents happening. As you can imagine, policymakers get really interested and they start to push for regulations. I will go into a little bit of details around regulations in the coming slides, but as you can see, it's we're going through this transformative phase. On one side of the equation, adoption, supply. On the other side of the equation, a more rigor around that adoption. So the need for AI audits will become quite more clear. And I'll give you a little bit around regulations. I would mention first, in the European Union, there is a big piece of regulation already in a very mature stage, probably coming out over the next month or so. It's called the EU AI Act. Think about it in a very simplified manner as like a new GDPR 2.0. It has pretty much a lot of the characteristics of GDPR in terms of how horizontal it is and how, in some sense, the requirements are quite comprehensive to large businesses. It operates with a very broad definition of AI. Some systems that you might even yourself not consider AI, EU would consider them AI. So it's quite important and impact both vendors and users of those systems. And if you were on the wrong side of things, you're looking for a 6% fine based on your global revenue. So big numbers. As you can see, a lot of sectors are going to be affected. They are probably going to be considered as high-risk sectors. I could name biometrics, credit scoring, forms of insurance, HR, tech, etc. So lots and lots of industries will be affected by this. So big event to happen. And just to wrap that up, the AI Act, for the high-risk areas of applying those systems, it demands something called the third-party conformance assessment. Third-party conformance assessment is basically an AI audit. It's an AI audit focused on a particular form of assessment or standards assessment. And as you can imagine, this is creating a huge demand for AI audits in this space as we go along. The second dimension, that's more kind of North America end of things, is the whole US. In Europe, as I mentioned, very horizontal, very cross-sectorial as well. In the US, it's extremely decentralized. I'm picking up for you an example of the regulatory landscape for employment in the US. You have a law in New York City that has been started to get enforced already in 5th of July, demanding independent or third-party bias audits before you use candidate assessment tools, candidate screening tools, etc. We provide that as a solution, holistic, but this is the law that has been pushed through. And as you can see, not only you have the New York City law, but you have laws coming out of everywhere that will affect the world of employment. I can make the same chart for insurance. I can make the same chart for data protection. I can make the same chart for financial services. I can make the same chart for too many other sectors. It is extremely centralized. It's to the level of a city level in the US. So extremely important to be able to cope on a very scalable manner to all these requirements. So pushing out the idea of why this is such an important thing, it's not only a matter of customer care and go-to-market strategy for a lot of companies, but also a matter of complying to upcoming laws. Just as a final call, we built a very nice app, holistic, called Polaris. Polaris is this very nice database where you have all the regulations, lawsuits, fines, incidents that are happening around AI globally, loads and loads of contents. So I'm chipping in this product. Feel free to join the waiting list. We are releasing this product to the wider public early October. And so feel free to join. Plenty of information there for you regarding the upcoming things around AI. I hope I was able to justify why this topic is such an important thing around AI auditing. So let me go into a little bit on the specifics of what is an AI audit. And I try to focus on a bigger picture. If you have a company, you need to think about AI governance, you need to think about AI risk management into your company. Why you might be asking that, like, why is an important thing? As you can see, and I've tried to really put in this chart, and I'll lay the pointer here for you. This chart here is a very, I'm trying to be elusive in some ways for you to understand that you have different lines throughout your company that people are developing AI. So you have data science teams internally developing their internal tools. You have tools that have been through some form of MLOps as well. And you have tools that have been procured externally by third parties, So if you just say, look, the engineering teams, the ones that should actually care about this, I have nothing to do with that. I think that's the wrong move. We're seeing a lot of internal audit teams and a lot of different risk teams starting to think, actually, it's not only the tools that we develop internally, but also we need to look at the tools that are coming up from third parties inside the organization. So you need to have a function that are able to cover the whole company, almost like in financial services, people would say a third line of defense. You really need to have that third line of defense, because having just a first line and second line, of course, they have their own responsibilities, but you need to have someone that can really cover your business. So very important to look at that. And to do that, you need to think about the different types of audits. And I've created a very simple scheme of internal, external audits, governance, and technical. In this presentation, I will focus a lot on the internal or even sometimes external, but I'll focus more on the technical end of the audits. Just to very briefly talk about types of audits, you have technical audits, you have governance audits. Governance audits tends to look at more organizational level. They look more at processes. They look more at things that your team is conducting and how do you approach things. Typical example of a technical audits, for example, around training and awareness, around AI risks. That sometimes get covered during technical audits, but technical audits tends to be quite narrow in the sense that they look at specific pieces of technology. Today, I'll focus solely on technical audits because I think they introduce quite a different way of thinking about risks in general. These are the key elements of what we would say an AI audit should constitute. An AI audit should look at the definitions of the problems or the development element of the algorithm. It needs to look at the assessment component, how an algorithm gets verified, which risks are it looking at. It needs to look at forms of mitigation that have been applied. The mitigation could be mitigation around preventing a risk from occurring, detecting a risk from occurring, and of course, fixing them or correcting them so they don't occur anymore, or at least they're being treated. And finally, any monitoring techniques you have in place. Those monitoring techniques can involve systems to monitor. For example, monitor the such shifts, concept drifts, anomalies, etc. Extremely important to have that. If you have all those components in place, that's what we say you have a good assurance, which is a way for you to declare that a certain system conforms to predetermined standards, practice, or regulations. I'll go into some specifics now into the coming slides about each one of these dimensions. On the development end of things, you need to look at the data that is provided to the algorithms, the inputs and outputs, the simulation environment behind it. Look at the model, look at the objective functions, look at the formulation, the parameters that parameters being used on that model, and the processes. So basically, how people are designing, which infrastructure they're using to train, to build those models, etc. And I'm really kind of breaking down into 5 stages how, for example, an algorithm or model gets developed. So data and task setup, feature pre-processing, model selection, post-processing, productionized deployment. There are different, of course, ways that teams and companies, they tend to think about the model development process, different ways to frame this life cycle. But this is just a simple schema because I'm going to use that to highlight to you how forms of verification can be done at different risks. So, but before I go into these details of this intersection between these and risks, let me talk about some key risks to bear in mind. There are 4 key risks to bear in mind, at least at this point in time that we are. I will start first with AI privacy. AI privacy is a cousin of data privacy, and different from data privacy, AI privacy tends to focus on which manners I have to, for example, privacy to enhance the privacy or the security of my algorithm. So typical example for that is when you're doing data protection or data privacy, you try to you put effort and focus on data minimization as the big principle. Data minimization in the context of AI is definitely different. For example, if some of you are data scientists over there, typical example of data minimization will be feature preprocessing. So instead of us using all the features available to build a model, can we select a narrow amount of them? That's a way for you to do data minimization in the context of AI, not only in the context of data protection. That's one way, but there's multiple ways. I would say really what gets AI and risks being focused so much, I would say the key dimension is definitely bias. Similar to data, a lot of people focus on privacy. Bias is definitely the key dimension of risk when people think about AI. Bias tends to have different ways of interpretation, as you can imagine. You can have a concept of bias where you're treating groups maybe on two disparate manners. So, for example, your algorithm is performing better for one group than the other group, and that's a form of bias. Of course, there are levels, there are disparities who are acceptable. Every context is quite important to be taken into account, but ideally, you want to try to avoid as much as you can bias. So your variability is fine, but bias is definitely an issue. Another big concern of AI is always transparency. Transparency on a very technical manner gets cashed out as interpretability and explainability. And it's very important that individuals and people who are getting affected by those systems, they are provided with decisions, suggestions, so they can understand what is going on. How do you unpack this? Last but not least, performance and robustness. Typical risk that every type of data scientist engineer would understand. And then I would say robustness is dramatically important because you want to build a system that is safe, secure, avoids any vulnerable or tampering, and they can have a good fallback plan in place. This is basically what I was mentioning to you, the stages of development, the life cycle of development, and how each risk can be assessed. So if you're an AI auditor, for a particular case, of course, you identify, for example, robustness as a key risk of concern. You go to that stage of data setup and you ask the team, what are your strategies for data accuracy? For feature preprocessing, you ask the team, what are your strategies or methods you have in place for feature engineering? Can you demonstrate them? Can you show me that? For post-processing reporting, what are the forms of adversarial testing that, for example, you have conducted to verify your systems? Or for model selection, extremely important to ask, are you conducting any form of model validation? Are you using cross-validation, bootstrap? What is the form of procedures you have in place? Or even when you're productionizing deploying, what are the techniques you have in place to detect, for example, concept drifts, dataset shifts, and so on? As you can see, at every stage, different forms of risk, you have different ways to verify whether they are present or not. Extremely important to have that level of interrelation. Mitigation are basically procedures you can, of course, put in place in order to correct some outcomes. Usually, the process tends to be people develop systems, they assess them. Sometimes they assess only in a particular dimension. Hopefully, they're assessing more dimensions nowadays. And then finally, if there's a risk, if there's a concern, usually mitigations apply. And then this process is repeated because on machine learning and in AI, you really, every time they introduce a new component or a new dimension, this whole process needs to be repeated all over again because you need to really reassess the system based on the new techniques you put in place. Different forms of mitigation, human and algorithms. Human tends to be mitigations that are more on the governance level activities. So, for example, whether people have the right tools available, do they have the right skills available? Extremely important. But also on the algorithm ends, what are the methodologies? What are the techniques? Are they really working with the state of the art? Extremely important. Let me show you also how mitigation overlaps or interrelate with the stages of development. So, for example, if we want to do mitigation around the concerns of explainability or transparency of the system, for example, you at the data and task setup level, you can check whether do they have any form of dictionary of variables, dataset sheets, etc. Extremely important. Or, for example, at the post-processing and reporting, Are they applying some technique to build explanations out of the model, like line, sharply? Do they have, for example, model cards as a good procedure for them to be able to explain how the model got developed in the first place? Are they, for example, using as much as they can, with the limitations, of course, sometimes they can break, but are they creating by design interpretable models as much as possible? Because that tends to avoid a lot of the risks. And finally, last but not least, any recourse interfaces, any ways that you let them users come back and challenge, for example, some decisions. As you can see, again, as a good AI auditor, you go through a list, you check every component, and sometimes you need to test them. Sometimes you need to run some code, run some data through, get some outcomes, etc. It's not only a checklist exercise, but also an exercise of testing those components. Last but not least, assurance. Assurance is definitely a final outcome of this whole process. Different contexts, different ways. You're going to have different forms of assurance. It's very, as I mentioned on the slide, general and sector specific. For example, on the HR tech sector, assurance can be given by third parties, and sometimes those third parties needs to be accredited by somebody, some government bodies. Sometimes not. Sometimes they can just have a good code of conduct in place. For the AI Act, very likely they have to be registered with notified bodies. So that's an additional element. So different ways assurance can be provided. I do believe that if not in a year time, could be before that, insurance will become a big piece where people will be seeking particular forms of insurance for their AI systems. And that could be in the form of a product liability insurance, or if they're using AI systems for professional services, maybe it's going to be part of a professional indemnity insurance as well. Very briefly, and I will try to wrap up on just some key aspects of AI auditing. Usually, these are the typical concerns we hear from people around AI auditing. Usually, this tends to be a lot of the key stakeholders, CIOs and CDOs, extremely important, as you can imagine. AI tends to be quite an important element of their strategy and investment nowadays. But I would say, really, it has to work as a team, as a company level effort. And that's where internal audit teams play a big role on ensuring that there is a level of protection, or at least a process in place in order for people to adopt AI, but adopt AI on a confidence basis. And I'm always surprised. Sometimes we engage with professionals from other departments like HR, like finance and marketing. And the typical things that they come to us and say, we have a process for privacy. We have for privacy assessment. We have a process for InfoSec, but we have no process on adopting or ensure that AI systems we bring inside the company are actually working or have those that contain bias or are transparent. So there's this big lack of process around that, which creates an additional risk that a lot of companies are unfortunately exposed. So very important to bring up those pain points across the teams. These are some key activities that happens as part of an audit. Usually collect some project information around the purpose of the system, the outcomes, the team, the technology behind that. You conduct a risk assessment based on those key verticals like privacy, bias, robustness, transparency. Try to perform some form of analysis around the trade-offs between those risks and metrics that you can calculate. And finally, you're able to achieve an adequate level of governance. So what should be the adequate level of auditability or oversight and accountability that is required for those systems? Usually, it starts with interviews and checklists that you can share with developers and businesses, and then that gradually moves into a more technical form of assessment where code and data gets inspected. Very interesting to see what are the typical risk assessment and prioritization that sometimes gets required. Usually, as you can imagine, you can look at any AI systems in front of you and say, well, there's a risk here of bias, there's a potential risk here of robustness, there's a risk here of transparency. very important to prioritize what is actually needed. So going back to that example of HR, definitely bias and privacy are big concerns. They should be prioritized. And of course, transparency, performance, robustness, they are concerns, but on the list, they are second order concerns compared to bias and privacy. So prioritization is extremely important. And usually a way for you to prioritize is to think about the system. Does it have an impact on life prospects? Is it going to be used internally or externally? Do they have identifiable individual data or not? What's the potential financial damage, etc.? So usually each of those questions will trigger a concern. So the first one tends to be concern about bias, second one of transparency, the third one, privacy, and the fourth question about robustness. So that's a very typical and a simple way for you to have a quick assessment on a particular form of technology. Very vital to think about what's the right standards and the right metrics that you should apply. And every single application, you're going to have an acceptable level of performance as a barrier, as almost like this is the minimum that we can accept in terms of performance. Maybe we should go to this extreme here, get all these models and alternatives here who are maximally performant. But these are the bounds that have acceptability, for example, in terms of bias. So actually, in terms of models that are feasible, are just these three. So very important to have all this analysis in mind regarding the metrics, regarding the different ways you can cash things out. So extremely important to perform trade-off analysis as part of that. Last but not least, and I think this is one of the major theoretical contributions we did a few years ago, was around the right levels to perform an algorithm audit. When I say levels, as you can imagine, usually people think we should have white box access. I mean, I can really get access as much as I can to code and data into the company. Or maybe no, maybe I can just run a bunch of checklists and be able to get away with it. Actually, there are not only these two levels, or even the black box level in between, there are more levels, which we call the 7 levels of access to conduct an audit. To identify the right level that you should conduct, it's usually a risk-based approach. So if something is high risk, we tend to say, for example, if you're going to be developing a self-driving vehicle, tends to be something quite high risk. I would say society would probably expect a white box access to the system. It's going to be extremely important. But if you're just doing maybe a simple forecasting systems out of your spreadsheets for your own personal usage or your small company usage, I would probably say if you're gonna check some key components, probably a quick checklist or maybe an API access to it should be enough to suffice. So you don't need to disclose the technology, proprietary information, etc. Nothing like that. Maybe just a simple interface to test a few things is enough. And we were able to link that with the risk. And as you can imagine, the more access you give to someone, the better the feedback, the better the quality of the audit. So some situations, try to request as much access as possible. For other situations, just a access to the model through an API or just access to the data should be enough. Just some final points and I'll wrap up. AI auditing is really becoming a signal of sound business practice as well as a good customer care. I would say this is really not only becoming that, but it's over the coming years. And I'd say by the end of the week, at the end of the decade, as we wrap up, it will become a key requirement to conduct business. And as I mentioned, the second bullet point, it almost will become a handshake, such as SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3 are in this case. And I've just finalized with that. I do believe a lot of the audience here probably were alive last decade. And you probably remember that in 2010 to 2020s, even to the beginning of 2020, data was the big topic. So you had the professions arriving from that, data protection officers, even data scientists. I can probably put them on the bucket. You had legislation around data. GDPR is a big one, but California also has something around those lines. And you had a lot of new topics of practice and research, like data governance, data privacy, data security, etc. A lot of industries, companies were built around that. We say, and we really believe in that in the 20s, we will see the emphasis now on algorithm or AI conduct being quite important. By that, we mean being able not only to be able to test your AI system, but to demonstrate that they are behaving on a particular fashion. So it could be that they do not contain any bias, they are transparent, they are well-performing, they're safe, they're legal, they're sound. There will be, as you can imagine, AI auditing is one of those new words, but AI risk management, AI governance, AI compliance, you name it. There will be definitely more and more AI topics emerging. And this is a very exciting decade. We're just starting it. And I do think we're going to keep seeing more and more interesting applications down the line. I'll wrap up this presentation on going beyond SOC 1 certification. Again, thanks very much to the team from MindBridge for the invitation. I live here with an academic paper that we wrote a few years ago about the topic back in the day when we were more academics than nowadays. So happy to answer any questions, anything that you have in your mind. And thanks again for the opportunity to be here, team.
Adriano, I think we have some questions for you. So given that we've got a little bit more time, I'll start. So one of the first things I'll start with a good one first. So what is the most exciting, innovative use of AI you've seen so far?
I think I would say over the last few months, probably months, it's not even a year, I think, has been language models. I definitely think they are extremely impressive. We discussed this before, Rachel. I remember using GPT-2 or even GPT as it was back in my time. You started 2017, 18 or something like that. And they were not impressive. They were really rubbish. It felt like a random generator of words, you know. You would put some prompt in, and then it starts really kind of answer whatever you wanted, but then all of a sudden it would diverge to something completely that you didn't ask before. You wouldn't stop properly. And there has been a big jump on. I don't know if it's a term only performance, but I think on maybe our expectations were a little bit low, and the jump of performance was very high. And with someone has been following the whole work for an OpenAI, etc., where they start to really scale those models, get them big. I was not so bought into the whole idea of big models. I was always felt like, I don't know whether this is going to work or not. But I think as I discovered, going big at the same time, doing the whole trick about training based on human feedback, and doing a lot of conditioning as well on the background that we don't see. All those tricks together created this impressive thing that I think a lot of people have used it. And that has been the biggest breakthrough in my view. And I think language is the most precious form of symbolic manipulation that someone could do. And if you're able to manipulate language, you pretty much can manipulate a lot of other symbols as well.
Oh yeah, 100%. And my friends that work in the film industry are really excited about other kinds of generative AI, like Stable Diffusion and image generation. So there's lots of really exciting developments in AI right now. So yes, it's a great time to learn more about AI safety. So on that subject, some of the people watching this will probably be talking to lots of different vendors that might contain AI capabilities. So can you suggest a few questions that they should ask when they're talking to vendors of AI?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think that the first question I would probably ask is whether do they have any beyond the typical software development lifecycle policy that they have in the company, whether they have any policy specifically to AI within the company. Don't even need to go into specific policies, but do they have anything around AI governance? Do they have anything around some, how to keep rules around AI development? How are they structuring it? how do they thinking about the teams, etc. So I'm not even want to go deeper into demonstrating that they are applying those policies. They'll probably ask, do they have anything written about it? So if they don't have anything written, that tends to be, it feels like an afterthought. It feels like something that they didn't thought much about. And it's something which probably, I don't want to say it's a red flag, but it's something which we probably need to catch your attention. So do they have any policies? Do they have anything formalized? Extremely important. I think if they have, then I would probably start to ask them to provide us some level of evidence. Not a big deal, but I'll probably say, do you have, can demonstrate for me, you're saying, for example, on this document that you're doing all this benchmarking, you're testing against all the approaches, etc. Can you show me those numbers? Can you show me those results? They should be able to produce each data scientist can do that for sure. I think if you want to go a level beyond that, ideally, they should try as much as possible to bring a third party, conduct an audit, and be able to produce a report. I think that's the best level of assurance you can ask them to do. If they have a report for a third party, that's I would say that's iron proof in many ways.
Oh yeah, 100%. And as an auditor, I would thoroughly agree that third-party assurance is definitely the gold standard for trust. So yeah, that's a great answer. So one of the other questions that we've had from the audience is they were interested in a little bit more detail around how you assess bias and fairness in AI. So could you give some examples of where you've looked at that?
I would say there's a way more, of course, but I'll give the typical two examples where there's probably three examples that summarizes how difficult it is and how contextual it is to assess bias in AI. The first example is, for example, facial recognition. If you want to assess whether a software that provides some kind of biometric recognition, facial, speaker, name, background, etc., do not contain bias, for example, you need to look at the key KPIs. So, for example, on a facial recognition software, a typical KPI would be false negative identification rates. So, for example, do they, if I am Adriano, is it detecting that if I put Adriano's face, is it detecting whether it's Adriano or someone else, for example? And as you can imagine, if you throw there 100,000 faces, Adriano's, Rachel's, and Emre's, and so on, what are the error rates for people that look like Adriano? The people look like Emre, etc. So you need to break down the error rate by gender, by race, etc. If that disparity is not that big, okay, doesn't look like there's any form of bias emerging. But the disparity performance is quite leveled up, which tends to happen. A lot of the times people are using open source software, and we know those open source software suffer from bias, particularly facial recognition. You need to do something about it. There are forms of mitigation, performance improvement, etc. But you can do something about that. That's one. But as you can see, you look at the performance of the system and the disparities. HR, different context. In HR, you need to look at, for example, pass rates of different individuals. So it's actually nothing to do with the performance of the HR tech system. It's about, are they providing similar pass rates to, for example, men, female, over 40, under 40, etc. Typical example, 100 people apply. Let's say 10 are men, 90 are women, have 10 slots available for a job. You should expect to have 9 women getting the job, 1 man getting the job. That would be a good pass rates because 1 out of 10 got the job, 9 out of 90 got the job. So the similar pass rates, not 50-50 in this case. So that would be an ideal case for HR tech. Last but not least is healthcare. Extremely different type of use case. It's about performance as well, mostly, not about some about this typical kind of pass rate or outcome type of approach. The problem with healthcare is that in facial recognition, you could harm the performance of the model. You can maybe make the model a little bit worse for young people, so you can improve the old people performance potentially. In healthcare, you cannot do that. You cannot make things worse because the first principle of healthcare is do no harm. So you really need to push that up. So as you can see, 3 different contexts, 3 different ways to not only assess bias, but how to mitigate bias.
Oh yeah, that was a great answer, Adriano. So I really hope that's provided context for our audience. We're actually at time, so I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for your presentation today. I've certainly found it really interesting, and I'm sure our audience have. I think the next session coming up is with Sebastian Struckel from KPMG. So hop over to that session if you're watching, and enjoy the rest of the Mindbridge Edge conference. Thanks to everyone for your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Adriana.
Thank you.